Okay, then. I do believe we are recording. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 177. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. And 177, contrary to popular belief, is not a prime number because it is 3 times 59. However, I counted the number of questions we've got, which is kind of a large number. It's 37 questions. 37 is prime. Also, 37 used to be kind of a magic number for me. I just always had this fascination for the number 37, partly just because I was 37 at the year 2000. I remember thinking, long before the year 2000, man, I'm going to be 37 in the year 2000. That's old. But I'm even older than that now. And I've got the door closed. There's going to be no special guest appearances of little dogs in this episode because my woman and her mama are out shopping or something right now. They're probably going to come in loudly with a lot of like feminine hamana noises. And so I got the door closed. So you don't get to see the dogs. But, I mean, none of our dogs are 100% dog anyway. The whippet is like half gazelle. The littlest one is like half guinea pig and half monkey. And then the medium-sized one is like half gremlin or imp or something. So you're not missing out on a complete dog anyway. And I guess I should just start answering questions here. And the first question is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. An Ethiopian Fake Tig says, "You once said that the Buddha jumps off a cliff with his philosophy, and so does Nāgārjuna. But some monks make up complex topics not to do that. Can you explain that a little more?" So finally, after months probably, we've got like a Nāgārjuna question. So I got to wear the Majamaka fez. So get that situated. Get the tassel arranged in an aesthetically pleasing manner. So let's do this. I have said more than once that Gautama Buddha, the historical Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, from a historical perspective anyway, he just went to the edge of a precipice and just jumped off. And then in the centuries following that, a few centuries afterwards, you had Buddhist philosophers coming up with learned rationalizations for why they should back away from that cliff's edge. And then you had someone named Nāgārjuna who came along and he just jumped right off the cliff again. And so after that, then again, you had another wave of learned Buddhist philosophers giving profound excuses for why they should back away from the cliff's edge again. And the meaning for that, I suppose, if I can try to give a meaning for that, is that the Buddha was just jumping out of samsara. And any kind of philosophy is going to be samsaric. Samsara is perception. Samsara is symbols masquerading as reality. And so the Buddha just cut through that and just dived out of samsara, so to speak. But then you have like Abhidhamma scholars and various Buddhist philosophers that are saying, well, when the Buddha said don't believe anything, he just meant don't believe anything false. And so you should believe this here philosophy that we're formulating. And again, that's just backing away from the cliff's edge. I mean, it's just staying in samsara. Let's just memorize and master these philosophical doctrines instead of just cutting through all of that and bailing out of samsara. And so Nāgārjuna came along and he used a more logical, systematic way of just cutting through all the samsaric symbolic bullshit and just diving out of samsara again. And then after he established the Majamaka school, you had some Majamaka philosophers, and then after that you had the Yogacara philosophers and other Mahayana Buddhist philosophers who were just formulating these systems for people to cling to. And you don't want to cling to anything. You don't even want to cling to Dhamma or Dharma. So that was the meaning of what I was talking about there. The Buddhas just don't believe anything. Like in the oldest texts, like the Atthaka Vagga of the Sutta Nipata, have no view, no perception, no belief. It's like beliefs just don't stick to you, like water doesn't stick to a lotus flower. And people just can't deal with that. Even most Buddhist monks can't deal with that because you have to believe something. So long as you're not fully enlightened, you have to cling to some kind of belief system. And so Buddhist philosophers came up with a belief system to cling to rather than just wholeheartedly just bailing out of the whole system. Just stay here in samsara, cling to this belief system. And, it's a better belief system than just, being some village normie, I guess. But still, it's like, I'm not ready to become enlightened yet, so I'll just study how to become enlightened. Study the theory of becoming enlightened rather than actually becoming enlightened. And Madhyamaka was sort of a return. I had a Mahayana monk in Burma tell me, he was visiting. He told me that some Mahayana Buddhists consider Nāgārjuna to be like a second Buddha, just because of just the radical approach that he took, similar to the original Buddha's approach. But most people just aren't ready for that, including most Buddhists, including most Buddhist philosophers and monks. They're just not ready to just let go of everything. So they still are clinging to Dharma or whatever, which is better than clinging to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but still it's being stuck in samsara. So I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian fake Tig's second question, which is not about Madhyamaka or Nāgārjuna. So I'll take the fez off. It's a really good fez, though. It's a really nice fez. See here. It does mess up the hair a little bit when you take it off incorrectly. So Ethiopian fake Tig's second question is, you said you don't want women to vote, and I'm weighing the pros and cons. Don't you think taking away this power could infantilize women more? Right now, it's great because they have to work and study and be forced to pay bills. But if they give all that up, their mental faculties will go to shit. And he's Ethiopian, by the way. But let's see, where is it? Their mental faculties would go to shit and they would rely on men more. Not that that's bad, but we wouldn't be getting the great thinkers of our time like Nancy Cartwright. I have no idea who Nancy Cartwright is. So I guess I'm ignorant of the great thinkers of our time. But now he continues here with parentheses. He says, not to be confused with the person that voices Bart Simpson. I mean the philosopher. Well, that clears things up. Also, we're out of the parentheses now. He continues, also a lot of women are incredibly smart. Incredibly smart? I don't believe it. But they swayed by emotion to choose things. Okay, so let's go back up to the top of Ethiopian fake Tig's controversial question here. Well, I mean, to clarify, I didn't say I didn't really want women to vote. I mean, that's just kind of a silly thing to want because, I mean, you're not going to get what you want in a case like that. Like I was mentioning before, I mean, there'd have to be some radical overthrow of the whole Western civilizational system, I think. There'd have to be like some complete, like a total coup overthrowing the current status quo. I guess they could still sort of cling to the Constitution. I mean, they just, abolish certain amendments, like the amendment that allows women the right to vote. But still, I mean, it would take some sort of coup to do that. It wouldn't be done democratically. I just don't think that Western civilization is in any state to just abolish women's suffrage. So, So and then he asks, don't you think taking away this power and the right to vote would infantilize women more? No, I really don't think it will. I mean, I don't think so. So let's see. It's right now it's great because they have to work and study and be forced to pay bills. I mean, that's really not necessarily great. I mean, the old-fashioned way of the woman being like the center of the home, being like the emotional heart of the family, raising the children while the man goes out and works to earn money. I mean, there is a lot to be said for that old-fashioned way of doing things. And like I mentioned in the previous Q&A that elicited this question in response, women, for starters, just going with statistics, there's all sorts of exceptions to the rules. Some women are taller than some men, for example. But as a general rule, women value security more than men do. Men value freedom more than women do. And so women are more likely to vote away rights and freedoms for the sake of security so that you wind up with a kind of socialist mommy state, which it just causes civilization to decline because strength is demonized to some degree, independence of thought is discouraged, just meritocracy is discouraged. It's like everyone should be taken care of, everyone should be relatively the same, and it's just poison to what made Western civilization predominant in this world. Even countries that hate Western civilization are still wearing Western clothes, using Western technology, using Western infrastructure, driving Western cars, using Western invented computers, etc., etc., etc. So there is that. Also, women just, as a general, they've done studies on this. As a general rule, they're just less informed with regard to politics, economics, current events, that sort of thing. They're just more interested in other things due to psychological, sexual dimorphism in the human species. But also, there is an issue I don't think I mentioned with regard to the great thinkers of our time that Ethiopian fake Tig here mentions, that men and women are different. I mean, unlike what some nutty leftists will declare, men and women there is sexual dimorphism. We are genetically different, both physically and psychologically. And one difference between men and women is that there is more variation in the male than in the female with regard to just about anything, really. Like height, for example, or IQ, just brilliance. So that the bell-shaped curve, the statistical bell-shaped curve for men is wider, broader than for women. Women have a narrower statistical bell-shaped curve, for example, with regard to intelligence. So on average, we're comparable. But when you consider the variation, the super boneheads and the super geniuses are more likely to be male. That's one reason why, it's not the only reason, but it is one reason why just the greatest geniuses of world civilization, the Shakespeares, the Einsteins, the Isaac Newtons, the Charles Darwins, the Mozarts, the Bachs, they tend to be all male. I have read that there's a book written by Charles Murray, Human Accomplishment, where he does this statistical study of the people who are the most significant contributors to Western civilization with regard to culture and science and so forth. And the top ranking female is a Japanese woman who lived in the 10th century or something. She wrote some novel, The Tale of Genji. She is the most significant female contributor to Western civilization outside of the realm of politics. I don't think politics was on the list. You had Queen Elizabeth I, Margaret Thatcher, people like that. So it's another reason why. It's not really it doesn't really have anything to do with women's right to vote in that case, but it's just Ethiopian fake Tig brought up about how women are like the great thinkers of our time, and I just don't see that at all. I mean, if you had somebody say who was the greatest female thinker of our time, a lot of people in America would say Candace Owens. So, getting back to like the main point of this question, though, I do think that it would probably be to the advantage of Western civilization, at least from a Darwinian point of view, from the point of survival of the fittest and just cultivating strength and success, to go back to a more patriarchal system. Because women just kind of veered towards socialism and like outlawing anything risky or dangerous, that kind of stuff. And it just causes a decline of civilization, decadence. I think it was Sir John Glubb who wrote the famous essay, was it the decline of empires or the fall of empires or something like that. And he pointed out, and just going with a historical survey of great empires that arose and then fell, that one of the signs of the decline of an empire is women rising into social prominence and getting being put in positions of like great consequence. Aside from the occasional queen, which was more of a hereditary thing. But this is all quite controversial, and people should be entitled to their opinions, I suppose, and in America at least, should be allowed to express their opinions. But still, I do think that a more masculine society is just going to be more competitive and more likely to succeed, so long as it doesn't become so militaristic that it just starts attacking its neighbors, so that the neighbors all gang up and start attacking it. You know, Louis XIV of France would be a good example of that, or Napoleon. Not that I'm trying to pick on French people. So I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question. He says, thoughts on Joseph Goldstein. I've always wondered why he didn't get married. If there is anything that's known about him on the down low that I don't know about, 'cause I'm from Ethiopia, can you tell? That's why he's called Ethiopian Fake Tig, by the way, is because he's from Ethiopia. Allegedly. I really love his work. And still, this is Ethiopian Fake Tig asking the question here. I really love his work, and I want to know more about his personal life and what you think of him as an ultra left-leaning but not too crazy Dhamma teacher. Well, I've only read one book by Joseph Goldstein. I think it was his first famous Dhamma book. It was The Experience of Insight, which was a good book. I read it a long time ago as a junior monk. And I really don't know that much more about Joseph Goldstein. I've known a few people that met him who say that, of the founders of IMS, which would be Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, and Sharon Salzberg, that he's probably the steadiest, sanest of the three. That's just, secondhand account. I've never met the man. Really don't know that much about him. I know he's Jewish. He's a Jew-boo, as they say, as all three of them are. But that's it. I really don't know that much about him. I've never had much interest in IMS, Barre, Massachusetts, Insight Meditation Society. It's just sometimes people will send me information about IMS, and it's always like this, anti-white male stuff. It's like mindfulness of white privilege and, BIPOC retreats and this kind of stuff, just as a way of just showing me how crazy some Western Buddhism has become, including some of the most mainstream Western Buddhism. But I really don't know that much about Joseph Goldstein, other than what I've already said. So I'm moving on to the next question, and this is from Justin. And Justin says, I have struggled for a long time with sensuality, pornography, and casual dating. He's got causal dating here, but I think he means casual. Do you have any strategies for ridding oneself of these urges? I would like to follow the brahmacharya path before I either find a wife or go full celibate hermit. I am in my 20s, so the desire hasn't weakened yet. Have a great new year. Blessings to you and your sweetheart. Well, I kind of have some, maybe what could be seen as bad news. I mean, I can definitely relate to this, especially the pornography part or just the lustfulness part. I was never really into casual dating, and that was to my advantage as a monk. As a young man, from the time I was a kid, it was just like a tradition for me to have like a crush on some girl, some girl that I liked the most. And then I wouldn't act on that. I'd be too shy, too self-conscious. And then as I got older, I also had this, the uncertainty, the self-consciousness or whatever decreased. But then what increased was just a kind of intuitive reluctance to really commit myself to a relationship with a woman where I would conscientiously have to consider, lifelong commitment. It's like I always had this idea, you're going to date a girl, there should be like, it shouldn't just be like, I'm just going to date this girl once and score with her and then move on to someone else. I just could never operate that way. But especially as a young man, I was so lustful that it was really difficult for me to be a monk, and where even spanking the puppy, so to speak, is very much against the rules. And the thing is, it's not just going to go away. Eventually, as you get older, it'll fade out to some degree, but that's not going to happen until you're in your 40s probably. So the thing is, you don't rid yourself of the urges. That's just it's just built in. You're a red-blooded human male. It's just built in. And so it's not so much a strategy of ridding yourself of these urges, because you're not going to be rid of them unless something really radical happens. There's some kind of major change in your whole personality. Then maybe. You become a religious fanatic where you just cannot even tolerate a lustful thought. It's just your whole mind just recoils from the very thought of thinking that kind of stuff. Then maybe, although that's rare in lukewarm modern or postmodern Westerners. In Asians who still live in a traditional culture, maybe. In Europeans in the Middle Ages when everyone was Catholic, maybe. But lukewarm Westerners, too eclectic, too open-minded, it's really difficult to just have this stainless steel faith that is just going to require that you be a saint. So, for most of us, we're just stuck with lustful urges, lustful desires, and so forth. And so that's really where you're going to have to do the work, is just learning to detach from the desires, learning to live with them, like somebody who's living in chronic pain, for example. The best thing you do is just learn to live with it. Or someone who's, I think the women folk are back home again. So, see, where was I? Yeah, it was like living with chronic pain, or like you've got, now they're ringing the doorbell. This is just a minute. They locked themselves out. Okay. So, like someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, I used to know one of the world's leading authorities on it. At least he considered himself to be one of the world's leading authorities. He wrote books about the subject, learned papers, and so forth. And to cure someone of obsessive compulsive disorder, where they just have this chronic desire to wash their hands, for example, even if you cure them, the urges don't entirely go away. They just learn how to like detach from the urge. They observe the urge mindfully. This particular person that was an authority didn't like using medications. Medications would just be sort of like training wheels, but eventually you want to get off the medications and just learn how to deal with the situation, which is a genetic thing. And unenlightenment also could be considered a kind of genetic thing. You're just kind of born that way. And so, like, lustfulness, I mean, it's not gonna just, you're not gonna just be rid of it. As a general rule, some people, I mean, anything is possible. There can be miracles happening. But for the most part, for most of us, we just just have to train ourselves to resist the urges. And you don't resist urges like that through just like pushing them away or repressing them. Or some people, they'll just like have these meditative images of just like rotting female corpses and this sort of thing. That sort of thing really doesn't work. You can have a coroner who does autopsies on dead females, and it probably has very little effect on reducing his desire for his wife when he goes home. So it's just mindfulness and just learning not to react. And I'm not sure if well, it could give a kind of embarrassing, like a little anecdote from my own experience. When I was still a young monk, I was spending some time at a meditation center in Rangoon. Chanmye Yita it was. And I wasn't there for intensive meditation. I was there, like, I had to renew my visa or something, and so I was staying there. I knew some people there. And I was staying in one of the dorm buildings, and I just looked out the window one day, and I saw on the roof, underneath a different window, it was like glossy magazine paper that was flesh tone. And it was like, when I was young, I mean, my father kept pornographic magazines. I'd sneak into my dad's bedroom to look at his porn magazines when I was a kid, that kind of thing. And it was just, it triggered this, that could be pornography. And there was no internet, anything like that at the time. So I actually climbed out the window, walked across the roof, picked it up and looked at it. And sure enough, it was like 4 pages from some Japanese men's magazine. So I ogled that for probably at least half an hour before finally my conscience like impelled me to call a friend of mine who was like a teacher there, and showed him, look at this, I found this. So he got rid of it. But still, there was like this urge, like, whoa. And that kind of thing, I mean, it's just instinctive in the male human animal. So again, it's don't try to have a strategy for ridding yourself of like sexual urges. It's more just a matter of learning how to like experience the sexual urge without acting upon it. That is really where the strategy should lie. And from the Buddhist point of view, there are various ways of going about it. Like one of the main meditations, not classical Theravada Buddhist meditations to help young monks with lust, is meditation on the 32 parts of the body. Also just mindfulness, like satipatthana, just when the urge arises, you just see lust is arising, that kind of thing. Just detach from it. But it's very difficult. It's easier to detach from unpleasant things than to detach from pleasant ones. Like Mary Baker Eddy used to say, it's easier to cure somebody of cancer than it is to cure them of a bad habit, because they don't want the cancer, but the bad habit, at least some of the time, you really like it. And I got to make sure that we're not going to lag so I can get rid of some of these extra tabs that are up, but there's really not a whole lot that are up. So I'll get rid of that one. And okay, I guess we're doing okay. I should do all this stuff before I do the Q&A, but I don't. So let's see here. I guess I'll just move on to the next question. But good luck to Justin. This is from Austin. And Austin says, if dukkha, or suffering, is axiomatic, then is pain a phenomenally unavoidable datum? And so long as you are in samsara, so long as you're like thinking and moving around and that kind of thing, yeah, then dukkha it's the first noble truth of Buddhism. If you exist in samsara, you will experience dukkha. Which, even if you're enlightened, then presumably, at least according to the text, you're going to experience physical pain, even though you may not have mental aversion for that pain. So yeah, dukkha is the first noble truth. The first noble truth is the noble truth of dukkha. So if you live in samsara, you exist in samsara, you're going to experience dukkha. So, I mean, you can avoid certain kinds of dukkha. You can be careful so that you don't slip and fall and hurt yourself, that sort of thing. But, I mean, even if nothing happens, you can be in some advanced heaven realm where nothing bad happens. Still, there's just going to be like this boredom, this ennui or some such. Still, there's going to be at least a kind of restless dissatisfaction going on. That's like the most fundamental form of dukkha is restless dissatisfaction. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jimmy Ladd. And I really should try to stay a little more concise just because there's lots of questions. And if the video gets more than about 3 hours long, then I've got to reduce the size of the file to upload it onto BitChute. So Jimmy Ladd says, I remember reading a sutra where the Buddha said that a clan village was massacred because they ate fish. I believe it is found in the Ekkodaragama. Do you think that eating fish like this with unwholesome mental states can really result in such a fate? Well, it's apparently not a Theravada Buddhist text. This would not be canonical in Theravada Buddhism. It's not part of the Pali Tipitaka. I mean, first he says it's a sutra, which would imply that it's in Sanskrit, but then he says it's in the Ekkodaragama, which is like a Sanskrit version of what in Pali would be called the Anguttara Nikaya. So it's probably a sutta or a sutra that does not exist in the Pali Tipitaka. Again, I don't recall ever having read such a thing. I do think that Theravada would say, no, that you're not going to be massacred for eating fish. That in the Buddhist time, people still ate meat, for example. It's not even against the rules for Buddhist monks to eat fish. I mean, they're not allowed to ask for fish or meat, but if it's just put into their bowl, they're allowed to eat it if they would like to. And Devadatta infamously tried to insist that the Buddha require all monks to be vegetarian, and the Buddha refused. He said, you can be vegetarian if you want to, but I'm not going to require that monks be vegetarian. So getting to the actual question here, do you think that eating fish like this with unwholesome mental states can really result in such a fate? I mean, if you do anything with unwholesome mental states, it can result in bad things happening. I mean, unwholesome mental states are bad karma, which will result in bad things happening. So whether you're eating fish or eating beans or sitting in meditation, if you've got unwholesome mental states, then you are setting yourself up for unpleasant events. But, I mean, maybe there's like this village culture of just cruelty to fish. Just after you catch the fish, you're just like laughing while like beating its head in, this kind of thing. That was just like the whole village culture. Then there could be enough unwholesome mental states generated from something like that could cause a massacre of the village. Maybe. But I do think that this is kind of a vegetarian propaganda generated by later schools of Buddhism, that after Buddhism went mainstream in India, then it was easier to like discourage like killing animals. And killing animals is not, I mean, it's forbidden for any Buddhist really. So once Buddhism went mainstream, then you could sort of like try to enforce that and even put into the Buddha's mouth that, you know, even eating fish that somebody else killed is bad karma and you can have bad things happen to you. But I mean, the Buddha refused in earlier texts to even to forbid monks from eating fish. So it's the mental states. I mean, just an outward action is ethically neutral. I'm continually having to remind Western people, and sometimes Eastern people too, such and such action. I mean, ultimately, it's neither wholesome or unwholesome because it's the mental states that determine the karmic value of an action. You know, it's the volition, it's the cetana that is the karma. So, I mean, if you can't eat fish with wholesome mental states, then you're better off not eating fish. Of course, if you can't eat rice without unwholesome mental states, then you're just screwed. You know, just if you anything. So, I mean, if you can eat meat without generating unskillful mental states by doing it, then you're not doing anything wrong. So it would have to be some sort of really pernicious, unwholesome, immoral attitude that these people had adopted, worse than the average person who just catches fish. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Arpad. And Arpad says, could dis-ease, and then he's got sick in brackets, be a good English translation for dukkha? So, yeah, it's dis meaning like not, and ease meaning ease. Could that be a good translation for the Pali word dukkha? And it has been proposed by various Buddhist authors in the past. The main different, like the two main objections are, I mean, disease is already an English word that has a different meaning. You know, it means a kind of sickness, usually like a contagious one or a genetic one. You know, it means like a medical sickness. And so, I mean, that would cause confusion. Yeah, disease. Yeah, I guess it's just one. I somehow had the idea that there was like two different angles that I could take with that, and maybe there are two different angles. But yeah, I mean, the word's already taken, and it means something else. So, I mean, my general translation of the word dukkha into English is unease. Like if I'm writing a translation from Pali into English, usually I will translate dukkha as unease, which still, I mean, there is no exact English equivalent, but it does come closer. You know, it's better than disease or dis-ease because people will just see disease and think of, you know, the English meaning of the word disease. But unease is a less common word, and it can, I mean, there's more overlap with the Pali word dukkha than the English word disease. I mean, that would be roga. The word for disease in Pali would be roga, R-O-G-A. So yeah, unease, it has certain advantages. One advantage is that it pairs with sukha. You got sukha and dukkha are opposites. You got ease and unease are opposites that sound similar. You know, it has a kind of similar effect, like an aesthetic or emotional connotation that, you know, it's more similar to the Pali than saying, you know, like pleasure or happiness on the one hand and suffering on the other. You know, they don't sound the same. They don't have the same, you know, like etymological root, anything like that. So I would prefer unease to dis-ease. Although dis-ease, just like literally, yeah, it would be comparable to unease, but unease just works better, it seems to me. And I think unease works better than Ajahn Tunisaro's preferred translation of dukkha as stress. I mean, sometimes I'll just use the word suffering because that's just the standard translation. The most common or usual translation of dukkha into English is suffering. The noble truth of suffering. So sometimes I can use that, and it's not that horrible of a translation. But disease, yeah, it's just, the word has already been taken and means something else. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Scudamain. And Scudamain says, most of the time when I'm around people, I feel calm or neutral, but with certain people, I notice a tension or uneasy feeling. Is there any meaning to that experience, or is it just my own mind reacting? I don't like the idea of judging people, but around certain individuals, it feels different, like it happens uncontrollably. Well, I mean, for starters, there could be just some sort of subconscious, subliminal reaction to certain kinds of people. Maybe pretty women make you feel nervous, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, that's fairly common. But there's other things also. I don't remember the story very clearly. I could just be making a dumb shit move by trying to repeat a story that I remember kind of vaguely. But in one of Ram Dass's books, while he was in India, there was a certain Indian Swami who kept trying to make friends with Ram Dass. And for some reason, Ram Dass just kind of felt put off by him, just kind of felt uneasy around him, for some reason, just couldn't bring himself to quite trust him. And so finally, it got to this point where Maharaji, Ram Dass's guru, started teasing Ram Dass. I think he was hitting him, not hard, but, just kind of teasing him and giving him a hard time about how he doesn't trust, he's not a trustful person. And then Ram Dass is thinking, yeah, it's because of this Indian Swami that I don't trust. And then Neem Karoli Baba, Maharaji, just turns it around and says, no, you don't trust yourself. Because he's it's he does not have pure motives. And you're picking up on that. And there was just this intuitive, just kind of his heart just did not trust this person. And Ram Dass's guru, Maharaji, said, I mean, you should trust your own intuition on people like that. I mean, there are some people who just don't trust anybody. And most people like that generally aren't very trustworthy. It's you're using your own self as a kind of yardstick. My father used to tell me that. It's someone's jealous all the time, or they just don't trust anybody all the time. It's because, they're not trustworthy. They're getting away with stuff and they think everyone else is too, that kind of thing. But also, in addition to that, maybe, somehow combined with that, there is the idea that if two beings interact, they're creating a third being, which is an us entity. It's a multiple being. And Buddhism really doesn't talk about that much. I mainly have insights in that just from my own experience in life and just my own theory of the block of marble, the simile of the block of marble. That's how samsara works. It's my theory of everything, that contained within this uncarved block is every possible statue, which includes group statues. So you've got this group of beings that in a way are like a compound entity that are sort of generating to some degree a shared experience. Even at a less profound level, there's just the fact that mental states are contagious, which is one reason why the Mangala Sutta, I almost said the Mangala Buddha. The Mangala Sutta says that the number one blessing in life is not associating with fools. Second blessing in life is to associate with the wise. And one reason for that is because mental states are contagious. You hang out with foolish people, their foolishness is going to rub off on you to some degree. Unless you're just immune, like maybe a fully enlightened being. Likewise, if you hang out with people that are wiser than you, their wisdom is going to rub off on you. So let's see here. What's the actual question? Let's see. Is there any meaning to that experience, or is it just my own mind reacting? Well, I don't know exactly in your case because I don't know the details. It could be either. Um, but if it's your own mind reacting in a way that is noticeable to the other person, then of course their karma, their mind is in on the game too. But I think in a lot of cases, especially with me, um, it's just mental states are contagious. Somebody has mental states that just don't don't suit my system, then there's going to be a certain dissonance. And I'm just going to move on to Scudamane's next question. He says, coming from the monk life and having only a few robes to lay life, how much larger is your wardrobe? I always feel I have an unnecessary amount of t-shirts and it annoys me sometimes. Well, back when I was still a monk, I was thinking that, if I were to disrobe, I could still be semi-monastic and just wear like some uniform of just like gray sweats, a gray hoodie, that kind of thing. And it wouldn't be that much more elaborate than when I was a monk. But the thing is, I've got a woman, and most of the clothes I own, she buys for me. So, yeah, I've got probably 4 feet of closet rod in the walk-in closet off our bedroom, just shirts and pants, jackets, that kind of stuff, not even including socks and underwear. So, yeah, it's way more than 3 robes, definitely. But I'd be content with just a very simple wardrobe. But when you're living with a female who like wants you to look nice, has her own ideas about clothing and so forth, and buys you clothing for Christmas and so forth. I think I got this for Christmas last year. Well, 2024. So, I'm not going to resist it. It's not really a problem unless you make it a problem. Kind of reminds me of the sutta where the Buddha's talking about there's this rich man living in a mansion with a beautiful wife. He's got all this gold and silver and jewels and all that, but he's not attached to it. So he's still doing okay. Whereas you've got this poor person with an ugly, foul-tempered wife, and he's just eating rice and beans every day. And, he's just wearing rags and so forth, but he's attached to it. Then he's doing worse than the rich man with the elaborate wardrobe and the beautiful wife and all that. So it's, again, just outward acts are ethically neutral. It's the mental states associated with the act that create the karma and have the ethical value of being positive or negative or neutral. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, does celibacy have adverse effects on the prostrate? And I assume he means prostate. That's a very common typo that, sort of like saying mediation instead of meditation, which is one of the most common Buddhist typos in the English language. But Fred says, does celibacy have adverse effects on the prostate? Some doctors recommend draining the spuds occasionally. And yeah, when I was younger, up until I was in my early 40s, then yeah, you can get blue balls. It can be very painful if you don't have some release. But as I was starting to say, like up until my early 40s, I would have nocturnal emissions, which there's no rule against it unless you're going to sleep specifically with the intention of having a nocturnal emission. It's like you're trying lucid dreaming or something in order to have an orgasm in your dreams, then that would be against the rules. But just going to bed, just lustful or whatever, and then having like a sex dream at night, and that kind of relieves the pressure, like the hormonal pressure in the system, then there's no rule against that. And when I stopped having sex dreams as a monk, like in my early 40s, I missed them. But it's like your system is designed, at least my system was designed, that, it kind of if you got too much pressure, then you're going to have a release while you're while you're asleep or some such. It may not be that way for everybody. Some people may really have problems with blue balls. And in a case like that, I think there is some commentary saying that if you masturbate just for the purpose of alleviating, this painful condition or something, then it's allowable. But then I think the majority consensus is no, that's not true. If you're doing it on purpose, it's still very much against the rules. In which case, you may have to just deal with chronic discomfort of blue balls or whatever. But I mean, there's always a trade-off. I mean, which is more important? I mean, having a greater chance of having a healthy prostate, or like the chance of becoming fully enlightened. It's like some people, especially like you read about certain medieval Catholic saints, they were so saintly and so inhibited and repressed that they just had all kinds of like hysterical, like psychosomatic symptoms and so forth. Who knows? Maybe even like St. Francis of Assisi, the stigmata that he would get. I think he died of the stigmata. I mean, that's could be like a hysterical conversion reaction, like a psychosomatic condition just caused by just this intensive repression of one's natural urges. Just the hearing voices and seeing visions and all that of these medieval saints, a lot of that was just the price they had to pay for being saints, because it just goes against human nature. So then you got to have priorities. Which is more important to you? You want to be saintly and pure with like hysterical symptoms, maybe bad health because of it? Or do you want to be healthier physically and maybe in certain ways healthier mentally, but still just delusional and unenlightened? And you just got to make the choice for yourself. And it might not be all one way or all the other way. There may have to be some sort of, draw the line somewhere. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, my questions are about the Unabomber Ted Kacynski and his anti-technology manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future. In it, among other things, Kacynski says that the more technology increases, the more individual freedom and autonomy decreases, that people adapt to machines rather than vice versa, at the expense of our human dignity. It goes without saying that Kacynski's way of spreading his message was evil and repugnant, but I can't help feeling that some aspects of his message were on point. And then his first question is, have you ever read the Unabomber's manifesto? And no, I have not. I have read a few manifestos, but I have not read Kacynski's manifesto or Karl Marx's manifesto for that matter. I have read a few manifestos though. Like just out of curiosity, I read the manifesto of that fellow in, I think he was Australian, but he shot up some mosque in New Zealand. He had a manifesto that was online. I just out of curiosity, like as an anthropological study, I read that one. But no, I have not read Ted Kacynski's manifesto. So, second question from Romeo. What is your opinion of his anti-technology message? And I really don't think it's just one possible outcome, that technology in general is going to reduce people's dignity and freedom. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, it's like people talk about world government. Was the world government good or bad? But there's like so many different possible kinds of world government. It's like technology it's not just foreordained or preordained to just reduce human dignity and freedom. Like, I mean, you think about what the life of a peasant was like in the Middle Ages. I mean, did they really have more freedom and dignity than I do? I really don't think so. I don't think it necessarily works that way. That maybe like in certain general trends, it can be that way. Certain general trends may go the opposite way, where, I mean, technology does kind of free people up sometimes. Mama doesn't have to spend an hour every day churning butter, for example. I mean, that's not really decreasing her freedom or decreasing her dignity by just buying butter at the grocery store, driving there in a car. So, I mean, some technology does increase individual freedom and autonomy, it seems to me. Too much technology, like especially with AI, is really going to cause people to get dumber and dumber to some degree. People will just, ask the AI instead of trying to like research it themselves or work out the problem themselves. But yeah, I do not see eye to eye with Ted Kaczynski on that particular issue. Yeah, I mean, anti-technology manifesto. I mean, you want to be like to live like a Stone Age hunter-gatherer. But I mean, even Stone Age hunter-gatherers had technology. It just wasn't nearly as much as we've got. But I mean, there's a certain technology to like making flint spearheads and that kind of thing. And I mean, they had like a Stone Age hunter-gatherer may have had more physical freedom in a sense. They had way fewer choices, though. So we got more freedom in that sense than that we got more choices of what we want to do with our life. They're just going to be prehistoric hunter-gatherers. I mean, that's just like made up. That's just decided for them. So, yeah, I really do not entirely agree with it. I'm sure that in some ways he is correct with regard to that. And in some ways, I think he's just got it bass backwards. And it's mainly up to us to decide. I mean, if you're just like a sheeple, just go along with the flow, still you're going to have more freedom than a Stone Age hunter-gatherer in many respects. But still, I mean, it's not going to have the same effect on everybody. So, I mean, ultimately, we do decide. We are creating our own reality. And we are creating a technological reality at present. So let's see here. Let's just move on to Romeo's third question. What is your overall take on the effect that the internet, smartphones, AI, and other recent technology have had on people since they were unleashed on society? Yeah, I've already kind of touched on that just by saying it does make people more intellectually lazy and just kind of dumbs us down to some degree. Instead of spending an hour researching something, you can spend 3 minutes and just ask Grok. And I mean, it has certain advantages. I mean, it's not all bad. But I mean, the internet, I mean, it's almost like a deva power. The internet really is, it's like an additional sense organ that has been added to us, where, the internet itself is the sensory field, and the computer that has internet access is like the sense organ. So, I mean, it's not entirely bad at all. I mean, it has certain downsides, and anything has a downside. It's everything has a plus side and a negative and a minus side. A dark side and a light side. Just about everything. I mean, I've been trying to think of what entity, what phenomenon in this world is all one way or the other. It's like, I mean, even the bubonic plague of the 14th century wasn't all bad. I mean, it helped bring about the modern world. The survivors, they were all of a sudden, they had the same amount of wealth was distributed among fewer people because so many people died. People just prosperity, just boom, it went up. The standard of living went up. I mean, there were still like aftershocks, more plagues and so forth. That kind of thing would still happen. But I mean, like the Black Death, even that wasn't all bad. But I mean, Buddhism, I've tried to think, I mean, unlike Christianity, where a lot of people would say that Christianity has caused as much, suffering and misery and death as the opposite. It's like all the holy wars and all this kind of stuff, the Inquisition, witch burnings and all that. Buddhism, yeah, it does seem to be one of the few things in this world that seems to have more positive than negative. But maybe I'm just not seeing it. So I do think that internet, smartphones, and AI as it is now, they've got their good side and their bad side. And whichever side you want to emphasize, you do have a certain amount of choice in whether you're going to be wallowing more in the benefits or in the opposite of the benefits, the detriments. But of course, if we hit the technological singularity and AI just becomes, if not sentient, then able to mimic sentience well enough that it's like a billion times more intelligent than we are and is acting on its own cognizance, so to speak, then who knows? That could be the end of the world for all we know. That's why it's called a singularity. We don't know. We can't predict what's going to happen. We can't know what's going to happen once it happens. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. Really, I can't just spend too much time on one question because there's 37 of them, approximately. And this question is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, what do you think about food prohibitions like pork for Jews and Muslims or beef for Hindus? A superstition? And I don't think that it's all superstition, that it's sort of like legends that generally have some origin in fact. Like in Buddhism, there are food prohibitions for monks. Monks aren't supposed to eat tiger meat, for example, or snake meat, that kind of thing. They're not allowed to eat raw meat or drink raw blood unless they are possessed by a demon. Kind of a strange rule of monastic discipline there. But with regard to like the prohibition on pork, I remember my father telling me when I was a kid that the purpose for the prohibition on pork was that pork, being a kind of omnivore that eats poop and garbage and so forth, that pigs have a tendency, or kind of maybe a slight tendency, towards getting trichinosis, which was a really icky, scary disease that people could get, very painful. So it could be that the prohibitions on pork and like dog meat and other omnivores, I mean, chickens kind of got a pass, but pork, I mean, you can get trichinosis from eating pork if it isn't cooked well enough to kill the cysts, the little roundworm cysts in the meat. So that could be the origin of the prohibition on pork. The Jews go farther than that. Most people just think of pork, but Jews aren't allowed to eat any quadruped that let's see, it has to chew its cud and have a cloven hoof in order for it to be kosher. And it could be that there was some folk medicine or something, people just had this, they'd notice, well, pigs have a cloven hoof, they don't chew cud, and you can get sick from eating that. And rabbits chew cud, sort of, but they don't have a cloven hoof. And I don't know if there's any diseases people get from rabbits other than just rabbit starvation from eating only rabbits. Like shrimp. I think shrimp isn't kosher. Maybe shrimp goes, in ancient times, I know from living in Burma, where they don't have refrigeration, that shrimp goes bad pretty fast. So it could be something like that. So, I would assume that there was some like medicinal reasons for some of it, and maybe just superstitions for other parts of it. With regard to beef for Hindus, the cow is just considered to be the greatest benefactor of mankind. Even a few Buddhist texts emphasize that the cow is man's best friend, and it's like betrayal to kill and eat cows or to sacrifice them to gods, that kind of thing. The Buddha was really more against animal sacrifice than he was against eating meat. Partly because India was maybe ripe to turn away from animal sacrifice at the time, whereas just realistically he realized that India wasn't ready yet to turn away from eating meat or to turn away from war, other kinds of violence that involve killing. So, yeah, I think there is some rationality behind at least some of it, but not necessarily for all of it. It could just be like folklore, superstition, that kind of stuff is mixed in with certain kinds of empirical observations, like maybe you can get sick from eating pork sometimes because of trichinosis or whatever other diseases that pigs can get from like eating shit and stuff. And I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's next question. In the Middle Ages, or even earlier in Europe, which I guess would be classical Roman times, no commercial exchanges were allowed inside towns. They had to take place outside the cities because it was considered that exposure to such activity would corrupt the city. It was almost treated in the same way as prostitution or selling drugs done outside the town in designated spaces or at fairs. Does the same happen in rural Myanmar, and what do you think about this? Well, no, it doesn't happen in rural Myanmar. There are shops and marketplaces in the villages in rural Myanmar. There's no taboo against doing business inside of a village. And getting to the what do I think about this, I'm skeptical of this whole claim. I mean, there's like the agora was the marketplace, which was like in the center of many ancient towns. And I've never encountered ever before the information that like in medieval Europe, you couldn't do any kind of business inside of a town. Like there couldn't be any shops. There couldn't be any inns, no taverns, anything like that inside the city limits. Maybe there was like the walled, like the nucleus of the city might not have that kind of stuff, but the suburbs, where there's still a town, yeah, I just don't see it. I've never even heard of that. There's stories of ancient Greeks, going to the agora, buying and selling. It's presumably inside the town. I mean, I have heard that there wouldn't be like lending money at interest. That's the sin of usury in medieval Europe. The early Christians, I don't know when they gave up on the idea that lending money at interest was a sin. But that's one of the reasons why the Jews became prosperous in the Middle Ages and became hated in the Middle Ages, because it wasn't a sin for them to lend money at interest. And so they were making lots and lots of money, lending money at interest to the Goyim, to the Gentiles, if you will. So yeah, it doesn't happen in rural Myanmar, and I've never heard of this happening even in the Middle Ages, other than in certain limited contexts. I don't think it was that way in Rome. I mean, you just read some of the stuff that would go on, and you got people going to bakers and going to, you'd have like the market inside in the city center kind of stuff. Stay at the inn, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I am rather skeptical. I'd need some further evidence that in the Middle Ages or even earlier in Europe, there were no commercial exchanges allowed inside of towns, because I would guess that is not correct information, except maybe in certain isolated cases, certain towns, maybe like Sparta or something. So I'm just going to move on to Siddhartha Lohachita's third question. Could Plato be an arahant or have attained jnana or knowledge? For example, when he describes the world of forms or ideas, attained that through gnosis. So let's see. The world of forms or ideas in Plato, it is the metaphysical dimension where pure ideas exist, such as beauty, justice, the good, independent of the sensible and changing world, is the true and eternal. No, I mean, you can't know for sure, but I do not think Plato was enlightened. I don't think he was an arahant. And even when his world of forms is still multiplicity, it's still this as opposed to that. The ideal cat is different from the ideal dog. So there's still differentiation and so forth, which I would not consider to be the highest truth. I do not think Plato arrived at the highest truth. Sort of Neoplatonists, maybe, like Plotinus or Plotinus. I mean, he would have, in my opinion, a much better credibility as an enlightened being than Plato. Plato, I mean, he was just kind of making up stuff about Socrates. Even in ancient times, people knew that you couldn't really trust Plato to convey what Socrates really taught because he was just putting his own words into Socrates' mouth. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't take Plato seriously. There's an old saying that everyone, whether they realize it or not, is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, and I'm neither. I really don't have much use for either one of them. Yeah, Plato, I mean, if he was getting some sort of insight into a higher world of forms, still that would not be the ultimate highest truth, in my opinion. I'd go with Plotinus or Plotinus rather than Plato. And let's just move on to the next question. This is from Trzaskazis. Trzaskazis says, when someone is in a deep coma, does his mind work? Well, his brain isn't working, apparently. If you're in a coma, I'm pretty sure that your brain is just it's hardly even idling. It's still metabolizing, I guess. But I'm really no neurophysiologist. I'm no authority on what exactly your brain is doing when you're having a coma. And also, I haven't really read any like near-death experience stuff about people in comas. Like somebody comes out of a coma, do they remember anything? Are there any cases of somebody coming out of a coma and not just being surprised that it's 2 years later? They're thinking, wow, well, I mean, I saw myself, I rose up above my body and I saw it down there and I went into the bright light and then I just spent 2 years hanging out with these spirit beings in heaven and then I came back down. I've never encountered a case like that. They might be out there. But, I mean, if your mind is working, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, it wouldn't be your mind anyway. It's like, let's say there's some sort of spirit entity, let's just call it a soul. But, I mean, it's not ultimately real any more than your body is ultimately real. It's conventionally real, maybe at a higher level, a multi-dimensional level, but it still is it's like a higher, more refined level of delusion. A higher, more refined level of samsara. So in a case like that, your mind might still be working. It's like your mind, what you call your mind, like deeper levels of it that you may not have any conscious awareness of, may be still operating, working out certain processes or issues or whatever. But it's not really you. And it's obviously not happening at this level of reality or this level of samsara, this empirical universe. So I'm just going to move on to Trzaskazis' next question. And he says, is it possible for consciousness to exist without any perception or object of awareness? You always seem to be conscious of something, whether it's a thought, sensation, or external object. So if there's always a subject and an object, doesn't that mean pure consciousness without any content of perception cannot exist? Well, this was kind of an issue in early Buddhism. And the official position of Theravada Buddhism is that there always has to be consciousness of something. You can't just have pure consciousness. There always has to be perception and volition and other mental states accompanying consciousness. So even if you're in these formless realms, the realm of nothingness or the realm of infinite consciousness or something, there's still the perception of nothingness, the perception of infinite consciousness. It's like infinite consciousness in quotes practically. But there are also, like I keep saying, there's at least 2 suttas that contain fragments of some old verse, the entirety of which may be lost to the Pali Tipitaka, that implies that nirvana or nibbana is infinite formless consciousness. Unmanifest, luminous all around. So, some people would say that Vijnana, which is usually what is translated as consciousness, you've got Vijnana Khandha. It's one of the 5 khandhas. Vijnana Khandha always has to have an object. You can't just have pure Vijnana Khandha But if you get into just pure consciousness, then it's just like off the scale. It's like reifying the absolute. Pure consciousness, if that's nibbana, you can't perceive it. And if you can't perceive it, it's not in samsara anymore. So that's, once consciousness becomes pure consciousness, it just goes off the scale and is no longer samsaric. In which case you can say that from a samsaric point of view, it doesn't exist. And you could just say existence and non-existence are just purely samsaric ideas anyway. But it does seem to me that someone heading for enlightenment is, it's sort of like in calculus where you're getting into like infinitely small incremental changes or something. It's like you're trying to get to pure consciousness. That's like the path, it seems to me, could be described as, moving towards or working towards, progressing towards pure consciousness. And that's like what fourth jhana is, that sort of thing, or the signless concentration of mind. Animeta ceto samadhi, that kind of thing is, you're conscious, but there's practically no content. So you could say that from a samsaric point of view, you just keep getting closer and closer to pure consciousness until suddenly just poof. You can't quite get there within a samsaric context. It just doesn't work that way. And so I'm just going to move on to Terzaska's next question. He says, what one believes is also based on causes and conditions. Can we really choose what we believe? Well, like Schopenhauer would say, yeah, you can choose what you believe, but you can't decide what you're going to choose. That kind of thing. So, again, this just gets down to the issue of free will. Do we have free will? And from the Buddhist point of view, the indication seems to be that we don't, except maybe in this paradoxical way that is never really described or explained. From the point of view, the Buddha kind of rejects both alternatives, free will and determinism. He rejects free will in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which is traditionally his second formal discourse after his enlightenment. His first discourse that caused some of his disciples to become enlightened. His first disciples. And it's just like with regard to any of the five khandhas, you can't say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and reliably have it happen. And one of those is volition, sankhara khandha. So we don't have complete control over that, which means we don't have complete control over what we choose, what we decide. But on the other hand, he rejected the ajivakas, an ancient Indian religion that no longer exists, or an ancient Indian spiritual tradition, who were just strict determinists. So it's like he rejects free will and determinism. So there's like this middle path that is never fully fleshed out or explained. But some people seem to choose what they believe more than others do. And it's something that I can't really understand. I can't really wrap my head around how some people will just believe everything their religion tells them, or even worse yet, believe everything their political party endorses. They're just a staunch Republican or a staunch Democrat or a staunch whatever, and whatever is the position of their political party, they just go right along with it. I think it was William James wrote a famous essay about like believing and choosing what you're going to believe. And he talks about how it has to be something viable. You can't just believe anything. Some people seem like new age people. They seem capable of believing anything, but still it's like, it has to seem true. You can't just decide, well, I'm just going to believe that 2 and 2 is 5 from now on. Some really soft-headed person can do that, maybe. But so it's what you believe. It does seem to be whatever perception seems the most plausible, seems to fit in with your other perceptions most efficiently. That's what you're going to believe. But then again, now it just occurs to me that, belief is perception. Anything that you perceive, you're going to believe. So, golly, where do I go from here? can we really choose what we believe? That is the question. And from the Buddhist point of view, it does seem that we do not have free will. It would take like an autonomous entity, an autonomous agent to have free will, and there is no self in Buddhism, so no autonomous agent. So yeah, it would be based on causes and conditions. But still, the Buddha rejects just strict determinism, and so we're in this limbo of paradoxical maybes with regard to maybe, somehow. But that is a difficult question. And with regard to myself, I mean, it's like you don't have any choice really, but to believe what seems the most like plausible or likely, based on the information that you have. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not really going to make a call on that one because I do think it's kind of a paradox. But, I mean, just based on the evidence, it would seem that no, we can't really choose what we believe. We can't really choose what we're going to choose. It just happens based on karma, and you can sort of identify with it or detach from it and just let nature take its course. And, in a way, you sort of detach from the whole ego stuff that's going on. But I'm just kind of wallowing in trying to dance around paradox, and I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Fifth. And Fifth says, what books about or related to Theravada Buddhism would you recommend? From beginner ones to advanced. I already have your 3 books. Well, congratulations on having my 3 books. And the 4th one, there's a good chance it may come out sooner than later now. I might get back to that later, but I might be working on my 4th book again after an indefinite hiatus from just being overworked and not having time to really dedicate to it. But let's see here. What books about or related to Theravada Buddhism? Well, I mean, the best books about or related to Theravada Buddhism would be the Pali texts themselves. Good English translations if you are innocent of Pali. So, I mean, like the Sutta Nipata would be an excellent intro to Theravada Buddhism. The Dhammapada is one of the most well-known Pali texts. The Udana has a lot of interesting stories. The Majjhima Nikaya would be good for a beginner, although it's starting to get kind of into the technical, kind of dry philosophical stuff sometimes. There's one book called Buddhist Legends, translated by a person named Burlingame, which is a translation of the Dhammapada commentary. And if you're more interested in narratives and stories and just seeing what it was like in ancient India, then to read the Dhammapada commentary would be interesting. It's sort of like reading Aesop's Fables sometimes, or the Panchatantra, which I think is more of a Hindu text. It's just ancient Indian fables that have been sort of turned into like origin stories for verses of the Dhammapada, that kind of thing. So I think one of the earliest books on Theravada Buddhism or early Buddhism was by T.W. Rhys Davids. It was like Buddhist India, which was, I mean, it was written like well over 100 years ago, but still it was sort of like this breaking new ground, kind of a pioneering sort of a book that had a certain enthusiasm and excitement behind it that made an impression on me. Yeah, I mean, I would try to get as close to the original sources as you can. And then once you get like more advanced, I mean, once you get kind of an understanding of what the texts say, then you can start kind of diversifying out and, reading Joseph Goldstein or Walpola Rahula, that kind of thing. G.C. Pandey, I mean, once you know the difference between the Anguttara Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya, for example, then, once you're fairly familiar with the suttas, then G.C. Pandey's Studies in the Origins of Buddhism I would consider to be an invaluable study aid with regard to understanding what early Buddhism was like. Although he has his own biases. He's a Hindu, so he has sort of like a Vedantist take on early Buddhism. So, yeah, I mean, just kind of to recap, I mean, just start with Buddhist texts. Just read. I mean, most of them are translated in English now. And the ones that aren't translated in English aren't translated in English because nobody would read the translation anyway, because it's just so obscure of a text, like the Nedesa, something like that. But yeah, start with like the Sutta Nipata, which is the book that really converted me to Theravada Buddhism, at least to a really strong interest in Theravada. Dhammapada, you just read a few verses before going to bed at night of the Dhammapada. I used to do that. The Udana, Majjhima Nikaya, Digha Nikaya, that kind of stuff. I mean, you can't really go wrong with that. And that will give you just the straight information right out of the text. I mean, that is it. That is Theravada. You're not just reading about Theravada. You're reading Theravada Buddhism. Also, I mean, some of the books by Ajahn Chah, just the transcripts of his Dhamma talks, he taught in a way that was based on experience and that Westerners can relate to better than many other Asian like Dhamma teachers. But I'm going to move on to Fifth's second question. He says, do you think there is any benefit to a layman learning Pali? Well, I mean, if you're really interested in knowing exactly what the texts say, the Pali texts, you want to get as close to the Buddha's words as you can, then sure, there would be benefit to learning Pali for anyone that really wants to read the Buddha's teachings in as close to the Buddha's language as possible. And then you'll understand much better, like Buddhist philosophical terms, that kind of thing. I mean, just to learn the Buddhist philosophical terms, I mean, that in itself would be very beneficial. I mean, if you want to really understand what Theravada Buddhism teaches. So, that was kind of an easy question. So I'm going to move on to Fifth's third question, which is, when or where will we be able to get your newest translation of the Atthakavagga? Well, I don't have a new translation of the Atthakavagga. I do have just the translation of the Atthakavagga that I made back around 1997, which you can find it online. I think even the Wikipedia article on the Atthakavagga has, like, in the links, like the bibliography is linked to, like, a PDF of my translation of the Atthakavagga. My woman has been managing my official website, so that I'm not 100% sure that my Atthakavagga translation is on my website, which I think is panyobasa.org. I think panyobasa.com, panyobasa.org. Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at my own website in a long time because really I haven't added anything new to it in years at this point. It was mainly stuff that was before I started blogging. And then the new stuff was all going on to the blog. And then I stopped that first blog, the Nipa Pancha blog. And then I started a second blog, which is still up, although I haven't added anything to it in well over a year. And now I'm just my Buddhistic labors are mainly taking the form of videos now, including this Q&A. So, like I said, my fourth book, not including the Atthakavagga, just like this series of essays, collections of essays, it's going to be more autobiographical. That could be out. I mean, I'm not making any promises, but it could be out like within a month or two. But the Atthakavagga is, my translation of it should be online somewhere. And I do have some extra copies of it that I can send, like hard copies. It was always my intention that the Atthakavagga translation is just a gift of Dhamma. I should never sell it for money, that kind of thing. So it has been published a few times in small numbers, but I'm sure that a hard copy of it would be relatively rare. But it's out there. And let's see. I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. Sorry if I was not informative enough on that one. But there really is no new translation of the Atthakavagga. There was one person that was volunteering to edit it for me to make it into a more compact format that it could be published as a book again, a new edition, hard copy edition. But that's just sort of like in development hell or something. I haven't heard from the person that had volunteered to do that lately. So there's no telling. I mean, ideally, when I have more time, I'm not having to work for a living so much, then I could even possibly, try to find some donor or sponsor for just publishing a new edition of the Atthakavagga translation, because it really is an invaluable book. I do consider the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata to be probably, potentially at least, the most important piece of Buddhist literature in existence. It's like the largest fragment of archaic pre-Theravadan Buddhism that we have, in my opinion. And the teachings of it are radically different, although kind of similar, but still in certain ways radically different from the later, just orthodox, established Theravada Buddhist system. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. Let's see. Yeah, this. We've been at it for an hour and a half already. Cleefy says, what would a middle path for a practicing Western Buddhist? No, what would be a middle path for a practicing Western Buddhist? Well, you're not going to be able to follow the middle path as described by the Buddha as, the ethical middle path. Because the ethical middle path, the practice middle path between self-indulgence and self-torture involved wandering around homeless, dressed in rags, with no money, no family connections, silently begging for your food in the streets, sleeping under trees and in graveyards and this kind of thing. And, that's too extreme even for most monks nowadays. So, the middle path for a practicing Western Buddhist, first of all, there's more than one middle path. There's Buddhism itself is just, it could be called, Buddhist philosophy is like a collection of middle paths. There's the middle path between eternalism and annihilationism. That's a middle path. There's a middle path just between self-indulgence and self-torture. There's a middle path between, let's see, what would be another example? There's lots of them, of just these sort of dichotomies, or like free will and determinism. That's another middle path. So, if you're going to try and follow some semblance of the middle path as a layman, you'd have to don't seek out misery and don't seek out pleasure. You just kind of accept things as they go along, and you live your life prudently. You try to be moral and so forth, but you're not clinging to anything, and you're not running away from trouble, and you're not running towards trouble. So that would be a kind of middle path light. And then Cleefy's second question is the middle path even possible for a Western man or woman? And like I said, the ethical middle path of ancient India, that's too extreme even for most monks now. So, yeah, it wouldn't really be possible for a Western man or woman unless the Western man or woman renounced the world and went to Buddhist Asia and just started wandering around homeless and sleeping under trees and so forth. With or without ordination, I guess. But, the other middle paths, the sort of philosophical middle paths between eternalism and annihilationism, for example. You can adopt those kind of middle paths, philosophically. And again, just not running away from trouble or running towards it. That is a kind of middle path light that a layperson could get some proficiency at, I think. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Liberating Insights. And Liberating Insights says, I have listened to countless near-death experiences and an overwhelming number of cases, may have described some very tall spirits. Lorna Brine, maybe Lorna Byrne, who has seen angels and spirits since she was a little child and still does to this day, also states that they all come in different shapes and sizes, some as large as cathedral pillars, and some can also manifest into human forms. Do you think it's plausible that it was the Buddha's spirit that some observers seen him as 27 feet tall? I consider that unlikely. I mean, anything is possible. So maybe in some people's private samsaras, that would have some plausibility. But personally, like in Vinaya, the Buddha is considered to be 3.5 times the height of an ordinary human. In the commentarial tradition outside Vinaya, like in the commentarial tradition connected to the suttas, he was 4.5 times the size of an ordinary person. And I think, I'm not exactly sure why they had him be so big when obviously he couldn't have been, in my opinion. But in with regard to the Vinaya rules, where he was 3.5 times the size of an ordinary person, one possible explanation for that is that it just made it easier to follow the rules. If you can't wear a robe that's bigger than 9 handspans by 6, I think. It's been a long time since I sewed my own robes, but the average robe nowadays would be twice as big as the allowable size. Like what Thai monks wear or most Burmese monks wear, it would be much bigger, twice the size of the Buddha's own robe, assuming that the Buddha was the size of a tall man, but not the size of a giraffe. So they just made it easier to somehow. It's like with regard to the height of a bed, a high bed is one where the bottom of the frame is more than 8 finger widths above the floor. So if you go with the Buddha's hand was 3.5 times the length and width of an ordinary hand, then you can sleep in a bed that's way up off the floor, and that's easy. And some monks maybe wanted to do it that way, and so in ancient times even, they just kind of changed the size of the Buddha's hand span in order to make it easier to follow certain rules. That is a possibility. But otherwise, why on earth would people think that the Buddha was 27 feet tall or even 3.5 times the size of an ordinary human? I don't know. But I'm not sure that they're seeing the Buddha's spirit, his disembodied spirit as some gigantic man. Maybe, but there's really no evidence other than, nowadays people are saying that sometimes spirits can be 27 feet tall or something, but that's really insufficient evidence to really make a strong case for it. That probably is just some kind of weird mythology. But I don't know. And I'm just going to move on to Liberating Insight's next question. He says, what do you think of this famous surgeon's witnessing a near-death experience in progress? You can view it here at Liberating Insights on YouTube. It's 12 minutes long if you have the time. Yeah, I did watch the video. I think it's the same video. It was a 12-minute long one. It was one of the most recent videos that was uploaded by Liberating Insights on his YouTube channel. And there's some heart surgeon talking about how they were doing surgery, like repairing a valve on this man's heart. And it was like he just kind of died on the operating table. It was very tricky, and he was just sort of failing. Like they needed the artificial heart and lung machine to keep him alive, and he just wasn't kind of taking over, taking up the slack from the machine until finally they were trying and trying. It was just, there seemed to be no way of saving him. So they just turn off the machine and just sort of close him up and leave him for dead. And then 20 minutes later, he revives. He doesn't wake up, but his heart starts beating again after 20 minutes. And, he starts breathing on his own, without the help of the machine. And so then they rush in and, finish sewing him up and everything. And then after he revives, he regains consciousness days later. He's telling them about, he had like the classical near-death experience. His spirit or astral body raises up, floats up above the operating table, and he looks down and sees his body down there. He sees the doctors and so forth, and he goes up into the bright light, etc. And according to this surgeon, he was seeing things that he shouldn't have been able to see because, he was like clinically dead for 20 minutes. And he's like describing how, he was wondering where the anesthesiologist went. He saw the two doctors there, but and that was after they'd already given up on him, and then he's like mentioning how he saw this list, this long, like a chain of post-it notes that were stuck to something that weren't there when he was still conscious. They were there when he was unconscious and clinically dead. There was just like this messages for the doctor that he was supposed to get back to after the surgery was over. He shouldn't have been able to see that kind of stuff. So what do I think? That kind of stuff happens. That's what I think about it. You can say, like I was saying earlier, that even though the individual person from a Buddhist point of view doesn't ultimately exist. Even our soul doesn't ultimately exist, just as our body doesn't ultimately exist. Our body apparently does obviously exist. And so you could argue, well, there's also like a spirit, like an astral body and so forth, that from within a samsaric context clearly exists, even though at the ultimate absolute level, it's not ultimately real. It's just part of phenomenal samsara. So I think it's quite possible that there can be some kind of astral body or spirit that goes through these events of a near-death experience, rises up and sees the body down below and goes into the bright light and communicates with spirit beings and comes back again. There's many, many cases of that. And sometimes they'll see things that they shouldn't be able to see. It's like there's other near-death experiences where I remember reading one where this woman rose up above her body on the operating table and she could see that there was something on top of the fluorescent light over the operating table. And then she tells that to the doctor or the nurse or something afterwards, and they look and there's no way she could have seen it. Or there was one who saw a tennis shoe on a ledge outside the window in this hospital, and you couldn't see it from the floor level. It was like a 4th or 5th story window, but on this ledge right below the window, there's like a shoe sitting there, and supposedly there was no way she could have seen it, but when she was out of her body floating around, she happened to see it, and then she told them, and then they went and looked, and there it was. So, this kind of stuff, it happens a lot. Maybe not, every day at every hospital, but still it does happen. And my father firmly believed in this stuff. He claimed that he had had out-of-body experiences before. So, sure, I can say that from a samsaric empirical point of view, there could be some sort of astral body that leaves the physical body. The Hindus certainly believe in that. But that ultimately it's no more real than the physical body is, which from the Buddhist point of view, even this physical body that you can see doesn't ultimately exist. So yeah, I can accept the conventional existence of a soul. It's just sort of like this multi-dimensional entity of which, this is just one aspect. But ultimately, at the highest level, it is not ultimately 100% real. Conventionally real, potentially real, conditionally real, but not ultimately real. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, why are you doing the Jim Carrey alrighty then at the beginning of your videos now? He did it mostly on his Ace Ventura movies. And it's just convergent evolution of speech patterns or something, because I've never seen an Ace Ventura movie. Really don't know who Ace Ventura is. I know who Jim Carrey is. But I never saw any of the movies in which he says that. It's just random chance, I guess. Cosmic coincidence. Two great minds converge on the same alrighty then. I don't know. And so I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question. He says, don't you feel like whomever set up this simulation called Samsara made it a little too difficult to stop participating and exit once you realize it's all bullshit? Well, whomever set up this simulation is us. We're the ones who are generating it. And I mean, we would stop generating it and stop participating in it if we really did fully realize it's all bullshit. But the thing is, deep down, we're not fully convinced. At some superficial philosophical level, we can say, yeah, it's all bullshit. But deep down, we are still invested. Deep down, we still got some delusion going that takes it seriously and clings to it. And so we don't become enlightened. But this question did remind me of a certain quote from a profound movie. It's one of my favorite movies. It's called Avalon. It was filmed in Poland with Polish actors, but it had like a Japanese director and a Japanese person doing the soundtrack and so forth. And there's a certain, I mean, it's the movie Avalon. It's like a parable of samsara, a parable of unenlightenment. And there's this character in this virtual reality video game, which the movie is based on. This Avalon is the name of this game. There's this character in the game called the Bishop, and he says the following. He says, "Which is the greater challenge? Which is the better game? Which would you choose given a choice? The sort of game that you think you can win but can't, or alternatively, one that seems to be impossible but isn't. Maintaining a precise, delicate balance somewhere in between throughout every level of the game, that's what keeps it going, and it's all up to us." So, I mean, that's the parable of samsara. You know, it's like, it's sort of like the middle path between seeming impossible but not being impossible, and seeming possible but not being possible. Did I say that right? Seeming, let's see. You think you can win but can't. It's like the middle path between like a game that you think you can win but can't, and one that seems to be impossible but isn't. That's samsara. It's a kind of samsaric middle path that helps to generate the game. But really, I mean, we're the one who has set up this simulation called samsara. Maybe you could say it's like some deeper aspect of us, some multidimensional entity that is generating us too, but still it would be like our, quote, soul, unquote, which isn't ultimately real, that is generating our reality. Just like we're generating our reality in our own dreams. Which, I guess, kind of applies to this next question from PSA. PSA says, if everyone is anatta, or without a self, ultimately, does that mean that everyone we meet is just a manifestation of our karma? Not just a manifestation of our karma, although they would definitely be that. But at the same time, I mean, we're a manifestation of their karma. And then there's like the group entity, the compound entity, in which, I mean, they're a part of this us entity that we are also a part of. And that's really not what Theravada Buddhism teaches. Theravada Buddhism really doesn't go there. This is just based on my own experiences in life that I even mention group or compound beings, you know, the us entities. And like the closer you are to somebody, the more obvious it can be. Like if you're really intimate with another person, you've got a close connection, then it becomes more obvious that there really is like this third us entity that both of you are part of. But it's sort of a holistic or synergistic thing where it's greater than just the two parts. You know, it's like its own being. So, yeah, I mean, in a way, I mean, there's the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism that took this to its extreme. I mean, they were sort of like Leibniz's monadology, where everything you are experiencing is, I mean, there's no physical matter at all, and it's just all a projection of your own karma. I'm pretty sure that's what at least some Yogacara Mahayana Buddhist philosophers were claiming. So that would be what PSA is proposing here, would seem pretty much along the lines of that. Although the earlier schools of Buddhism were more invested in a kind of qualified materialism, and so they didn't really push it that far. They didn't go full idealist like later Mahayana Buddhists and like 19th century German philosophers did. But everyone we meet is not just a manifestation of our karma, because, I mean, there's another being there from a conventional point of view that is generating us, and it's because there's enough similarity that we're able to seem to interact. And then also, if you go with my hypothesis or theory of compound entities, then the two beings are forming a third compound being, which is sort of helping to generate itself. Kind of. Sort of. But this is really difficult stuff to really talk about or just grok when you hear somebody else trying to explain something that English language is never really designed to explain. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. Xenothoid says, in the suttas it says, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Are there any non-compounded phenomena? This seems to imply that truly irreducible phenomena would be permanent. I wonder if this is the basis in Abhidhamma for believing in the four ultimate realities. So, I mean, in the suttas, it doesn't say all compounded phenomena are impermanent. It says sabbe sankhara anicca. So I think what Xenothoid is rendering or translating as compounded phenomena would be sankhara. And a sankhara doesn't necessarily mean compounded. A sankhara means something conditioned, something that exists because of a cause, something that has a beginning and an end. It doesn't necessarily have to be compounded. I mean, that might be more of like the Sarvastivada Buddhist interpretation, where the Sarvastivada Buddhists declared, yeah, all like combinations are impermanent, but like the initial Dhamma or Dharma, the ultimately real speck of reality, that's eternal. That's what the Sarvastivada Buddhists taught. Theravada Buddhists don't go that far. They say even an ultimately real speck of pure, whatever it is, earth element, let's say, even that's only going to exist for like a trillionth of a second. So it's a sankhara. That's a conditioned thing, not necessarily a compounded phenomenon. It's just something that exists because of conditions, something that has a beginning and an end. Well, of course, anything with a beginning and an end would have to be impermanent, wouldn't it? So anything that is the result of a cause is impermanent. That's essentially what sabbe sankhara anicca means. So, are there any non-compounded phenomena? You could argue that nibbana is a non-compounded, or it's not a sankhara. So, nibbana is unconditioned. And I think there are some Buddhist philosophers who would claim that space is unconditioned, although Theravada Buddhism doesn't really go that far, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, the main non-compounded or unconditioned phenomenon would be nibbana itself, and that is not impermanent. That's why you've got sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe sankhara dukkha, and then sabbe dhamma anatta, because it's anything is without self, including nibbana. When it's talking about dukkha and like suffering and impermanence, that applies only to samsara. That applies only to sankharas in samsara. It only applies to what is conditioned. Whatever is conditioned is conducive to suffering or unease, and also is impermanent. But absolutely everything, whether it's conditioned or not, is without self. It is not self, and that includes nibbana. So they have to use a different word. Sabbe sankhara for dukkha, sabbe sankhara for anicca, but sabbe dhamma for anatta, because anatta goes even deeper than impermanence and suffering. That applies all the way down to ultimate reality. That applies to nibbana itself. And maybe empty space if somebody thinks that that is unconditioned. But Theravada Buddhism, really the only... In Abhidhamma and the Abhidhamma commentaries, they have this strange idea that the only ultimately real space is an ultimately real space that is bounded between two particles of matter, between rupa kalapas, which is kind of strange. It doesn't seem to be really good logic to me for some reason. But yeah, in Theravada Buddhism, sankhara doesn't necessarily mean a compounded phenomenon. It means anything conditioned, anything that is the result of a cause. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question, which is the karmic stream permanent? Well, from the point of view of Orthodox Theravada, I would say no, it is not, because if you become enlightened, that ends the karmic stream, especially once the enlightened being dies. That would be Orthodox Theravada. But, I mean, if you want to be more esoteric, you could say, well, the karmic stream is... I mean, you could say, in a sense, I mean, if Einstein was right with regard to time being the fourth dimension, then, in a way, everything is permanent in a sense, because the past still exists in a sense. So there is that, in which case, I mean... the unenlightened, miserable us is never going to completely disappear. It's still going to be a conditioned or conditional virtual statue in this block of marble. But from the point of view of Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, the karmic stream ends when the enlightened being dies. And you stop adding to it when you become enlightened, even before you die. Then it's just sort of running down, just kind of running its course without any new additions to it. So presumably, if a fully enlightened being was like immortal, he didn't have to die at any time, then his karmic stream might just exhaust itself over, a few billion years just on its own, in which case, even then it wouldn't be permanent. Once the enlightened being stops adding to it and it's just running down without anything more, like reinforcing it, then you would think eventually it would just run out, unless you just have an infinite amount of karma stored up. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Xenothoid. He says, you've said you rank the Old Testament relatively low among religious texts in terms of wisdom. How good are the texts that are explicitly called the wisdom texts of the Old Testament, such as Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, etc.? Yeah, and then what's the wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, which is in the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonicals. Sirach, that was like... No, that wasn't Spock's dad on Star Trek. That was like the famous Vulcan founder of Vulcan wisdom. I think it was named Sirach, wasn't he? I'm just wandering here, lost in the wilderness. Yeah, I mean the wisdom texts of the Old Testament, like Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament. But it's worldly wisdom. I mean, it's like Jewish worldly wisdom. It's still very this worldly. It's not the kind of wisdom that transcends samsara. I mean, the closest you get to any wisdom transcending samsara in the Old Testament is like figurative stuff, like God, you're not supposed to say God's name, or God never showing his face, He shows his behind to, what was it, Elijah or somebody, but he won't show his face because it's kind of symbolic of God doesn't have a real name or a real face, or at least not one that a human being could possibly perceive. So that, in a way, is kind of getting transcendental and otherworldly in a kind of mythological, poetic, symbolic kind of a way, which is, it's a higher kind of wisdom than just, the stuff you see in Ecclesiastes or Proverbs. It's like, I can't even think of a good proverb. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men, which I think is a warning in Proverbs against, like, Gentile women. Or maybe just immoral women in general. So, yeah, even the wisdom texts of the Old Testament are just worldly wisdom. It's not really trying to transcend samsara in anything remotely resembling an enlightened way, unless there's just something that I'm just not thinking of or overlooked. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yoshibui. And Yoshibui says, is reifying the absolute sort of like asking the question, what's before the Big Bang? Yeah, sort of. Yeah, reifying the absolute, it's like trying to draw the face of God. It's just like I was saying in the Old Testament, God doesn't show his face because kind of symbolically he doesn't have one. Just like Moby Dick doesn't show his face in the novel Moby Dick because he's symbolic of God. God does not have a face. God does not have a color. God does not have a form, like a visible form. All that applied to Moby Dick too. So Moby Dick actually had more advanced wisdom to it than the Old Testament of the Bible, in my opinion, even though it's not scripture of any religion that I'm aware of. But let's get back to Yoshibui. Is reifying the absolute sort of like asking the question, what's before the Big Bang? Yeah, it's sort of like asking the question, what do you experience when you're not experiencing anything? Or, what do you perceive when there's no perception? It's like a koan sort of. There's no correct answer with regard to something like what is the absolute like. There can be no correct answer. What is the correct statue in the uncarved block of marble? It's kind of a question like that. Reifying the absolute is you're trying to give a form to something that is formless. And we don't really know what's before the Big Bang. There could be other forms before the Big Bang. It's like sometimes they'll say that you got like a black hole that, it's like, it's just matter is collapsing into this black hole, which then it's such a infinite density that it in a way makes a hole in space so that you've got all this energy just spewing out the other end, which could be like how the Big Bang started. At least some theoretical physicists theorize this. I think Stephen Hawking theorized this also, that black holes are like exit points from this cosmos, and then it could like just go through a wormhole or something and come out the other end as some sort of Big Bang or something similar to a Big Bang that's like creating a whole new universe, a new astronomical universe, I should say. So it's not exactly the same, because before the Big Bang, there might still have been something that theoretically could be discernible, but there's like this, what do you call it? Singularity that you just can't get past. It's like this barrier. So, that would apply to reifying the absolute also to some degree. It's just that when you reify the absolute, there's no form on the other side of the singularity. Whereas with the Big Bang, there might be. It's just that we have no access to that. So I guess I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Rui. And I do hope we're over halfway done. So anyways, Rui says, how long did you go with looking at your reflection? I assume he means without. So I'll just start over and just add the out to the without. How long do you go without looking at your reflection in a mirror during your mendicant days? And when you did, was it accompanied by a feeling of dissociation? Well, the one rule that I always broke as a monk, even at my strictest, was the rule that says a monk is not supposed to look into a mirror unless he's got some kind of sore on his face that he's investigating. You know, you've got like a sore on your lip or something, then you could, without breaking any rules, look into a mirror to like investigate it. But I read in the Vinaya Mukha, which is a book on Vinaya written by a Thai Sangha Raja over 100 years ago, I think, that he says, if you're shaving, it's okay. And that was good enough for me. It's like, okay, because I've always been kind of a klutz shaving, you know, I'll always be nicking myself. And so I always looked into a mirror when I was shaving. So I would shave maybe once every 2 weeks. So yeah, I'd look into a mirror when I was shaving. Or if you just happen to be like, you're staying at somebody's house, they've got like a guest house for you to stay in, and you go to the bathroom, there's like this big mirror in the bathroom. You know, you see yourself. I might not be like standing there admiring myself, but at least you'd see yourself in a mirror. So usually it'd be like 2 weeks, unless I was like squeezing. I'm not even going to go there. Not even going to go into gory details. But I mean, it's just like standard skin maintenance stuff, maybe. And then, you know, if you just happen to be somewhere where there's mirrors, then you'll see yourself in a mirror then. But there was no feeling of dissociation, really. I think there was more of a feeling of dissociation after I dropped out of the monkhood and started doing videos where I'd be looking at myself and it just seemed weird. It's just like, is that really me? That kind of thing. That would be more of a feeling of dissociation than looking into a mirror, because I mean, old habits, I mean, some of them just don't die. You know, they just go dormant or something. And so, I mean, I've been looking into a mirror since I was a kid, and you just go without looking into a mirror for 5 years or 10 years or whatever. I mean, it doesn't just, you don't just forget that. It's like riding a bicycle. It's just, you're just used to it. It just happens. You know, maybe if you look really different than usual, there could be a feeling of dissociation. I remember one time, I just spent like I just spent at least 3 months in the forest at Alondo Kasaba National Park, and I rode this raft down Patolong Creek till I got to the Chindwin River and tried to ride the raft down the Chindwin River to get to the city of Monua, but it wasn't working. The raft just was not, it just didn't move fast enough to really get where I wanted to get going fast enough. So anyways, I finally get to this meditation center where I was going to stay in Monua, and there was mirrors in the bathroom. So I looked in the mirror and I just looked like this emaciated, sunburnt scarecrow with just skin peeling off from the sunburn and everything. And that was a feeling of kind of dissociation, because my residual self-image, like in the Matrix, just was not like what I was seeing in the mirror. So anyways, let's just go on to the next question. This is from Practice Metta. And we're almost done. By golly, this is the last questioner. Golly gee sakes. Practice Metta says, is it essential to be able to sit on your heels for extended periods? And that's kind of a weird and interesting question. Most people would not ask such a question. But in some monasteries, in some monastic traditions, you're supposed to squat on your heels while doing Sangha Kama, which would include the recitation of the Patimokkha. And I mean, some monks can recite the Patimokkha so fast, it's like they're an auctioneer, that even though I had memorized the Patimokkha as a monk, their mouth was faster than my ear. And so they would be done within like 25 minutes. I would recite the Patimokkha. It was my duty to recite the Patimokkha at a few monasteries I lived at. And my mouth just does not move as fast as these auctioneer monks. And so even if I was going full speed, the best I could hope for would be like 35, 40 minutes. And so you've got to remain in a squatting position for half an hour or more sometimes. And it is painful. In fact, I have read that one of the self-tortures that the Jains would do in the Buddhist time in ancient India is just to remain in a squatting posture, because you don't fully realize just how painful squatting gets after like half an hour. I mean, it's like your knees and ankles are just like screaming in agony sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, it's at some monasteries, it is essential, especially in Burma. I think in Thailand, a lot of them wimp out and just sit during formal recitations or sangha kama in meetings of the sangha. That some monasteries, the monks will just sit. Although it does say in the text that a monk is supposed to squat, sit on his heels, and it might have been a little more difficult for me than for some other people. My father couldn't even squat on his own heels. His legs just wouldn't bend that far. Maybe I inherited some of that from him. That, like sitting in the full lotus was pretty painful for me for a long time also. Eventually, though, you do get used to it. But still, after like half hour or so, it starts to hurt. So I could really relate to reading that some of like the ancient Jain ascetics would do their self-torture by just remaining in a squatting position for hours, and probably their knees and ankles and the soles of their feet would just be screaming. Is a lot of people just don't realize. I mean, it's sort of a reflection on dukkha, that you just remain motionless in just about any position, and sooner or later you're going to start feeling discomfort. Just remain in a standing position. Some like Tanjidon Sayadaw of Burma specialized in standing meditation, where you meditate in a standing position. You just stand there motionless meditating, and the soles of your feet just start to burn. It hurts. And most people don't realize just how painful not moving can be, because it's just this habit. You're lying in bed and you start feeling uncomfortable, you just roll over. You're sitting in a chair and you start to feel uncomfortable just without even thinking. You just kind of shift into a slightly different postures where it becomes comfortable again. You're standing in one place. Maybe if you're like a soldier on watch or something, you might have to remain motionless. But I mean, most people just don't stay standing still long enough that their feet just start to burn with pain. And squatting is another one. Most people just wouldn't occur to them that all you have to do is, like, if you're not used to it, you just squat for 15, 20 minutes and already you are in serious pain. But, I mean, if that's just too much of a problem for you, you could maybe try to find a monastery where everybody sits during the formal acts of the Sangha. Or you can just practice a lot. Because I used to do that. Like when I was reciting the Patimokkha, you have to keep reciting it or you forget it. Then I would just stay squatting while I was reciting it. And it helps you to hurry up and get it over with. But also it kind of gives you practice at squatting so that, you just kind of get used to it. At least it like prolongs the window of comfort, or at least non-agony. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Practice Metta, our final questioner of the Q&A episode. And he says, did you find this posture challenging initially? And if so, how long did it take you to become comfortable with it? Well, I've kind of already touched on this question in my answer to the previous one. But yeah, I mean, after the first, especially at first when you're not used to it, after the first 15 minutes or so, it starts to hurt. But then if you just keep doing it, then, it just prolongs the window of non-agony, as I was saying. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't take all that long, depending on how much you practice. A few months, and you can double the original length of time that you can squat without agony. I think for some people, there's always going to be a certain amount of agony after a while. But still, I mean, it's just, you're an ascetic. I mean, if you're a monk, then, I mean, you just have to put up with this shit. It's like, I mean, that's what asceticism is just being okay with discomfort. Also, to some degree, just being sort of aloof from comfort, not giving a damn about comfort. So, yeah, I did find it challenging initially, although I survived for 30 years as a monk. So it wasn't like prohibitively challenging. And just over the period of months, I guess, I just got used to it. I mean, there's worse things than the pain of squatting. I mean, if you're in the tropics, just the heat. Like, I'd be doing the Patimokkha, or I'd just be attending the Patimokkha. Usually, I'd be reciting it at Taungpulu Chalt Sindoya, which is in the blazing hot wastelands of central Burma. And so you're squatting. You're kind of sitting on your heels with your elbows kind of resting on your knees. You're going like this the whole time. Everyone is squatting like this with your shoulder uncovered, and there'd just be like sweat just dripping off both elbows as I'm squatting like this, till there'd be like these puddles of sweat down below, because it was just blazing hot most of the time there. And that was more of a challenge than the occasional squatting, because the sweating is happening a lot. And most of the time, especially in the hot season and the rainy season when it doesn't rain, because it's this blazing hot desert wasteland. Well, the only time it's comfortable is in the wintertime. But let's just move on to Practice Meta's third and last question, and the last question of this Q&A. He says, and I quote, "What are your thoughts on pursuing ordination at a local Thai or Burmese monastery here in America? While in Thailand, I learned that ordaining as a foreigner is more complicated than simply arriving with sincere intention. Wat Pa Nanachat appeared to be an exception, but unfortunately the heat and humidity there triggered my eczema, or is it eczema? A skin condition." And I can relate to that. I mean, I've got sort of like a seborrheic skin type. I've got oily skin. And I would have to bathe at least every 2 days, or I'd just start breaking out in like dermatitis, which in a way prevented me from really just taking up the wandering life, which in Burma was kind of a non-starter anyway. I tried it a little bit. But just wandering from place to place where you may not be able to bathe for a while, I'd be a mess. But let's just get back to the question. What are my thoughts on pursuing ordination at a local Thai or Burmese monastery here in America? I would not consider that to be optimal, unless maybe you can just find like this really good monastery that I don't know about. But the thing is, like in Burma, I assume Thailand is similar, but in Burma, they do have like almost all of the big name meditation centers, for example. Places where Western monks are most likely to ordain, traditions like Pa'auk, Mahasi, Mogok, these kind of traditions, Upandita, Chan Myet, all of these places have a branch monastery up in the hills where it's relatively temperate. It gets cold in the wintertime. That's the main problem, is just the coldness in the wintertime more than the heat in the summer. And so that is where the Western monks go. Or like Migadawan Monastery, which was kind of Taungpulu traditions equivalent to that, up in the town of Pien Uluan, also known as Mae Myo, just in the Shan Plateau, the foothills or the edge of the Shan Plateau, where in the wintertime it gets down close to freezing. And in the summertime, it's really not all that hot. I mean, it's kind of like the summertime in America. So, I mean, there might even be places that have air conditioning nowadays for like spoiled and pampered, soft, plump Westerners. But, I mean, there's great advantages to being a monk for at least a few years in Buddhist Asia. You get to learn you can live the way monks lived in the Buddhist time. I mean, if you're into that, you can wander around, you can sleep under trees, you can go for real alms round in a real village. You don't have to wear like the kung fu pajamas and the socks and the beanie and everything that technically is against Vinaya anyway. And you can just get insight into what it was like to be a monk in the Buddhist time, go for real alms round, and just, live in a cave. This kind of stuff that is much less likely to be possible in a Western country like America. And also, like, Western monasteries tend to be very spoiled and rich, and you're just, I don't know. There's not much austerity going on. I mean, you have to like really make an effort to be austere in like if you're ordained in the West. It seems to me compared to it's just automatic 24/7 austerity if you're living at some rough forest monastery in Asia. But I would assume that like places like Chiang Mai in Thailand, up in the hills, the edge of the Shan Plateau on the other side from, the places I stayed at, that, you're up at a high enough altitude that even though it's still tropical, it doesn't get that hot. So I might try that. I mean, seriously, I would strongly recommend anyone who wants to ordain, wants to renounce the world, spend at least a few years in Buddhist Asia. Because you learn a lot so much of the practice of being a monk is just living the life, which, in the West, a monk in the West it's like a tropical plant that is living in the temperate zone. So it has to be in like this special protected environment with people taking care of it. It cannot live naturally, like in the wild, so to speak. That really struck me as a monk when I came to the West, that really you're like a potted plant. Instead of being some wild philodendron living in a jungle, just prospering in the environment, you're like this potted philodendron in a greenhouse with people having to come in and water you and all this kind of stuff. And it's just two very different worlds. So yeah, definitely I would recommend, if at all possible, try to find some place up in the hills in Asia maybe, where, if at all possible, anyone who's going to be ordained as a monastic should spend at least a few years in Buddhist Asia, just because you are in an environment that you're just surrounded by Buddhism. You can live the way the early Buddhist monks lived, like in the Sutta Nipata, and it's like a blessing. First time I could go for a real alms round when I got to Thailand before I even got to Burma, just going for alms in Bangkok. It just seemed like such a blessing to really be able to go for a real alms round. So if it's just your only option, you consider all the possibilities and your only viable option is to be ordained in America, then, try to find at least a place that has Western monks. Don't just go to like some Thai or Burmese temple, because there's going to be almost no monastic discipline there. It's just going to be like a cultural center. Thai, Sinhalese, Burmese, Cambodian temples in the West are more cultural centers than monasteries. It's just the lay people come to speak their own language and eat their own ethnic food and chat and do their ethnic ceremonies, and it's there's not really much deep dhamma going on. You got missionaries there who are more interested in preaching than in practicing. So yeah, if at all possible, I would try to find some place in Buddhist Asia where the climate is not so hot and sultry, if possible. There's a plus side and a minus side to everything, a light side and a dark side. So, at first, I didn't want to go to Asia. When I first became a monk, I was ordained in America because I didn't want to be distracted by visa hassles, having to learn other languages, this kind of thing, other than Pali. But it just turned out that Asia was far superior of an environment, and coming back to America was kind of the beginning of the end for my monasticism. Just like Western women compared with like Burmese women. It's a whole different animal. The Burmese women are just like modest and demure, and they just consider you to be a holy man, and that's the way they prefer it. They might, there's some that might flirt with you a little bit or something, just in the chance that you might drop out and want to marry an Asian girl. But in the West, women see monks as just another kind of man. They're all fair game, that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's just, if you're going to be a monk, Buddhist Asia is superior to the West. That's just my experience. And we are done, because there's no more questions after that. So, like I should always say at the beginning, and practically never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, especially about early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, just Dharma in general, some Western philosophy even, meditation, this kind of stuff. Me personally, I can answer questions about me personally pretty easy. Then feel free, no more than 3 questions per episode per person, please. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.